Good morning, everyone. Welcome to How to Be a Disability Ally, our webinar. We'll give it just 30 more seconds maybe to let everyone trickle in, and then we'll get started. If you want to go to the next slide, Marty, just do some quick Zoom housekeeping. So first, we're in webinar mode, so you're automatically muted and you can't see the other participants. Of course, you'll see the speakers the whole time. If you don't mind, please ask questions via the chat box. They'll pause a few times throughout the webinar to see if there are any questions. If not, we'll definitely go over them at the end. This session is being recorded and will be available after today on our website. And you'll see there the resources will be at centralonaging.org. Next slide. So I'm going to take a few seconds to introduce our two speakers today. First, we have Samantha Nevins, who's currently the Executive Director of Disability Rights and Resources, a Center for Independent Living in Charlotte. She's a nonprofit leader with over 25 years of professional experience implementing and evaluating health programs for marginalized populations. She has served a number of national, state, and local aging and disability committees in both Florida and North Carolina, and frequently provides ADA training and technical assistance to local businesses, schools, and municipalities as part of her work as a leader of a CIL. And next we have Marty Musser. She's the Advocacy Director of Disability Rights and Resources. Disability Rights and Resources is a center for independent living, which covers Cabarrus, Gaston, Mecklenburg, and Union counties. Her advocacy work focuses on civil rights and discrimination issues related to disability. She is Certified American with Disability Acts Coordinator through the University of Missouri. She serves on the board of the directors for the National Council of Independent Living as the Southeast Regional Rep and also co-chairs the NCIL Civil Rights Committee. And so now I'll turn it over to our two speakers to take it away.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Kristen. As she mentioned, my name is Samantha Nevins, and I am with Disability Rights and Resources. And we will be presenting to you today on how to be a disability ally. And first, you heard a little bit about us, but my pronouns are she, her, and visual description of myself. I am a Caucasian woman in my 40s, and I have red hair. Today it's straight. I have some funky black and white earrings, and I am coming to you from my home office, but there is a screen background that says Disability Rights and Resources on in back of me. And now I'll have my co-presenter introduce herself.
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning, everybody. I am Marty Musser. I use she, her pronouns. Quick image description of myself. I'm a white woman in my 30s. I have long light brown hair. It's kind of wavy today, and I am wearing a navy turtleneck and some jade earrings. And I am presenting to you from my home office as well, and you can see my kind of messy bookcases behind me.
Thank you, Marty. So as Kristen mentioned, we're going to go through the training today. You may stop us throughout for questions. As we transition, we'll ask for some questions, so you may put that in the chat or raise your hand to indicate that you have a question. We'll also have some time at the end for questions. But just off the bat, we are Disability Rights and Resources, and we are what's called a Center for Independent Living. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit based out of the Charlotte area. However, we cover, in addition to Mecklenburg County, our services are provided to persons with disabilities in Cabarrus County, Gaston County, and Union County. Next, please. So a Center for Independent Living, as I mentioned, we are a nonprofit. We are one of 340 centers for independent living across the United States. And we are federally mandated to do 4 main things. The first one is that we are consumer controlled. We do not call the people we serve patients or clients. They are consumers of our services, and therefore they remain in control of the decisions they make regarding their disability and how to live independently, and decisions related to their life and their quality of life. We are also consumer controlled. How it looks for our nonprofit is that 51% of my board of directors and my staff are persons with disabilities. So this is where representation matters as to the work that we do. So our consumers are also the people who help run our organization. We are also community-based, so we have a long, rich history of serving the 4 counties I mentioned. We have been around since 1980 when we were first established as a Center for Independent Living, and much of the work, in fact, all of the work that we do is in the communities, and we rely on our stakeholders, our community partnerships, and the people we have formed relationships with to accomplish our goals. We're also cross-disability, and this is something that sets us apart from other disability nonprofits, is that we serve all types of disabilities. So we serve people with obvious physical disabilities. We serve persons with mental health disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, hidden disabilities, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and just everything in between. So another thing that sets us apart is that we don't verify disability. So if you have any disability of any type and you call our office seeking services or information, we just say, "Sir, ma'am, do you have a disability?" "Yes, I do." "Okay, great. We're happy to help you." And then we are also non-residential. So despite having the name a Center for Independent Living, no one lives here at our facility. All of our work is done in the community, and the people we serve live and work and go to school in the community. So you're welcome to learn more about us. I'll give you a website at the end, and in case you're curious. We provide 5 core services as a Center for Independent Living. The first being advocacy. So we provide both individual and systems advocacy. We believe that people with disabilities need to be their own self-advocates. So we work with them to know their rights and know enough to speak about the issue they're concerned with. We also work with government offices, local, state, municipalities, as well as for-profit businesses to do systems advocacy, which is essentially changing policies and procedures and language to be more inclusive and to help achieve, removing barriers for people with disabilities. So we do both systems and individual advocacy. Marty is our advocacy director. So if you have any questions afterwards, you're welcome to pick her brain. We also provide independent living skills training. This can look like anything from our robust travel training program that we have, where we teach persons with disabilities how to navigate traveling to and from whatever it is they want to do using public transportation, STS, paratransit, etc. We are also providing kind of on-demand independent living skills. So this could look like budgeting, finances, next steps planning, cooking, adaptive technology, anything that helps persons with disabilities live independently. What do they want to accomplish? Of course, we have a robust information and referral department where we have a triage team ready to take calls and work on getting persons with disabilities placed into the information, plugged into the information they are seeking. We also have peer mentoring, where we have peer mentors, persons with disabilities on staff, specifically spending their time working with other people who have disabilities, and this peer-to-peer relationship that they form is really key. So peer mentoring is exactly that. They share their experience with one of our trained staff members who are peer mentors, and together they come up with a plan. We do institutional transition and diversion, which is basically we work to keep persons with disabilities out of nursing homes and long-term care facilities. Studies show that with the proper supports in place, that people can live and thrive in the communities if they choose to do so. And lastly, youth transition. So part of our core services that we provide is we take youth age 14 to 24, and we make all of the other services that we provide available to them as they start to transition out of mom and dad's house and into the real world, as we say. So maybe they come to us by learning what we do through a school program, and then we are able to work with them, whether it is achieving work goals, achieving a social life, sometimes getting to and from college or other training programs. So that is the extent of our 5 core services. However, we do much, much more. I say everything in between. Next slide, please. So now we have a video that will just kind of summarize what I've discussed about what we do as a Center for Independent Living, and we are your local Center for Independent Living. So I'll let Marty play the video. Thank you.
What is a Center for Independent Living? A Center for Independent Living, you can call it a CIL for short, is a unique organization that assists people with disabilities in achieving and maintaining independence. The function of a CIL, though, is often misunderstood. So let's take a look at how a CIL actually works and what makes it different from other types of services. At a CIL, the people we work with are consumers, not clients or patients. This is different from case management, where clients are often told what to do, or from doctors who, in general, diagnose conditions and prescribe treatments. We believe that people with disabilities themselves can make the best decisions for their own care and lives. So at a CIL, consumers with disabilities choose the services and assistance they want that will give them the skills, resources, and opportunities needed to live life independently, just like everyone else. And because 51% of the staff and board of directors of a CIL are people with disabilities, the people making the decisions, running the programs, and sitting on the board can understand and relate to the consumer's needs. This model provides a level of peer support, consumer control, and expertise not found elsewhere. But providing services isn't enough, because historically, people with disabilities have been treated unfairly, marginalized, and face discrimination and negative attitudes. A CIL also works to shift the perception of disabilities to something ordinary and acceptable, something positive, and a part of life. This includes striving to change laws that will even the playing field, making sure that people with disabilities have the same access to public places as well as work opportunities and life choices as everyone else. The focus of a CIL is on changing the system rather than fixing the person. Ultimately, a Center for Independent Living is a living, breathing representation of independent living philosophy. To learn more, watch the video, What is Independent Living Philosophy?
All right. Thank you, Marty. We'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so as we start the guts of the presentation here today, how to be a disability ally, it's first important that we define disability for the audience. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, disability is defined as a substantial limitation to one or more major life activities. It also includes protection for someone with a history of a disability. So let me back up. Not just the definition is for the person who has a substantial limitation to one or more major life activity, But the definition of disability and the protection under the ADA also is provided for someone with a history of a disability. So maybe they had a disability as a child, and then they have since outgrown that particular disability. Or maybe they had an episode of a disability, and now that disability is no longer something that's affecting them, but they do have a record of having a disability at one time. It also provides protection for someone associated with a person who has a disability. So this would be a spouse or partner, or a child who might have a disability. And lastly, there is protection under the ADA for someone perceived as having a disability, but they actually do not have a disability. An example of this would be if someone has burn marks or burn scarring, or maybe a large birthmark on their face. They might be perceived as having a disability, however, they do not. So again, we're defining disability using the Americans with Disabilities Act definition, which is a substantial limitation to one or more major life activity and the other protections I've just mentioned. Next. So demographics of disability, 61 million adults in the United States have a disability, and that's as being recorded as having a disability. This accounts for 26% of the US population, so that's roughly 1 in 4. But now I'm going to go on and further break down by functional disability type. Okay, so if you look at the statistics, in the next bullet point, around 13.7% have mobility disability. So that means they have trouble, serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs, followed by disabilities of cognition, okay, 10.8%. This would mean serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. Next, we have approximately 7%, almost 7% have disability type that impacts their independent living. Okay, so they have difficulty running errands without someone with them. Followed by hearing, all right, deafness and hard of hearing, then vision, blindness or low vision, followed by the last smallest number of functional disability type in the United States is disabilities involving self-care. So difficulty bathing or dressing oneself. This list again, 61 million sounds like a lot of people. It is a lot of people. However, as we go on in the next few slides, you will learn a little bit more about hidden disabilities, and you will probably think that there are a bunch more people who haven't self-reported as having or disclosed as having a disability. So we always venture to say this number is probably much, much larger if every single hidden disability and other type of disability is included. Next slide, please. And I think that's Marty. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Few more things. Disability can become more prevalent as we age. I know we have a lot of aging service providers on here. So 2 in 5 adults over the age of 65 have a disability. Disability is the only subset of the population that anyone can become a member of at any time. So whether you age into a disability, or you have an accident or something that causes you to have a disability, again, this is the only subset of the population where you might have been born not having a disability, but you could become part of this population and have a disability. And lastly, it's important to remember that some disabilities are readily apparent. Most are not visible. And we always like to give this, this statement is that remember that disability is not a monolith. So if you've seen one person with a disability or one person in a wheelchair, whatever type of disability it is, you've seen one person. All right. What works for them does not necessarily work for another person. And we always, when talking about disability, and especially under the ADA and its protections, it depends. That's the perspective we keep. It depends. ends, and we evaluate everything on a case-by-case basis. So I'm going to turn it over to Marty for a couple slides now.
Thank you, Samantha. So I'm going to talk more about hidden or invisible disabilities and what we mean when we say that. I have invisible disabilities myself, Samantha does as well, and it's a very important thing to talk about because I think we're all kind of comfortable with the concept of disability when we're talking about readily apparent disabilities. So meaning, you know, a person is disabled, you know, just at first glance when you look at them, whether this is because they use a wheelchair or other type of mobility equipment, or perhaps use a white cane or a service animal, or maybe have limb difference. But there are lots more of us who you can't tell when you first meet us that we are also disabled. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but just to give you an idea of some of the types of invisible disabilities that exist. The first one, psychiatric disabilities or mental health issues. I'm very pleased with the progress we've made in our society in terms of talking a lot more about mental health issues. This is one particularly that I feel like so many more of us experience in our lives, and enough so that we meet that definition of disability under the ADA that Samantha shared. It also includes things like TBI or traumatic brain injuries, epilepsy, which is a good example when Samantha was speaking a few slides ago about having a history of disability. So disability in your past that does not impact you today. Epilepsy is one of these that someone can experience in childhood, and then as they age, it can become less of an issue. Not true for everybody with epilepsy, to be clear, but it can work like that for some individuals. Also, things like HIV or AIDS or any kind of acquired condition, things like diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, and then finally, learning disabilities. Okay, so we're going to pivot now to kind of best practice and how to interact with people with disabilities. But before I jump into this, we'll pause for a minute if there are any questions so far.
Marty, there were a few questions in the chat, so I'll just read it. Someone said, do you consider dementia as a disability? And then the next person said, wouldn't that be under cognition?
Yeah, so dementia absolutely would meet that definition of disability that we use most often. There are lots of different ways that people define disability. It can become particularly important when we're talking about access to services. Some of those kind of working definitions become a little more narrow than the one that we're using for you today. But I will point out to you that under the ADA, and the bulk of my advocacy, which hinges on civil rights protections and issues of discrimination, that definition in the ADA was very intentionally broad. And this is not an ADA specific presentation today, although we do a lot of training on the ADA. That broad definition, like I said, was by design because these civil rights protections were intended to apply to as many people as possible. This is also very similar to the definition that we use within our own agency. As Samantha said, we do not have any kind of verification process where you have to show us any medical documentation of your disability. So yes, dementia absolutely meets that broad definition of substantially limiting, excuse me, one or more major life activities. So great example. Any other questions?
I don't see any more.
Okay, so we will keep moving right along. So as I said, we're going to start talking about just some best practices when it comes to interacting with people with disabilities. And we're going to start a little more general, and then we will get into a few disability specific things for you to know. So we'll start out. This one might seem obvious, hopefully it seems obvious to many of you, but introduce yourself to the person exactly the same way you would with someone who does not have a disability. always remember to speak directly to the person themselves, not their companion or assistant if they have a PCA or sign language interpreter. Always remember that you are speaking to the person and they deserve to be treated with the same dignity and respect as everybody else. And then this last one you see on this slide goes along with the image on the left of the screen that says, just ask. I kind of consider this to be the golden rule of interacting with people with disabilities. If you want to provide assistance, ask first. It's that simple. And so when Samantha said to you earlier that disability is not a monolith and two people can have the exact same disability, and what that means and looks like on a day-to-day basis can be very different for each of those two people. So you might have a friend who has cerebral palsy, let's say, and you know that they really appreciate if you, kind of scoot ahead and open doors for them or whatnot. That might not be true for someone else with the exact same disability. And this example of opening doors is actually a very good one. In the South, we love to be kind and polite and help each other, which is great. But sometimes we're so anxious to help that we get ahead of ourselves a little bit. And so with opening a door for someone as an example, in that instance specifically, it's better to ask because for people with mobility issues specifically, they might intentionally like to open doors for themselves because that's part of their exercise that they're getting in each day and maintaining their strength. It also you can throw someone off balance very easily. And that door example is a very good one. It's obviously a very well-meaning thing to do, but you can actually kind of jeopardize the safety of a person with a disability in that type of situation. It can be very easy to throw someone off balance and they could fall and potentially injure themselves. But so just generally speaking, beyond just going in and out of doors, just always ask the person. It's very simple to say, hey, can I give you a hand or can I help you? An even better thing to ask is like, what is the best way for me to help you? At our Center for Independent Living, and this is true of all centers for independent living, we view the person with a disability as the best expert on what they need and what is going to be the most helpful to them individually. So with that thought, kind of keep in mind this golden rule, just ask. Okay, so these next few slides have this title, Interacting, Don't Make It Awkward. In my experience, a lot of times we tend to get in our own way more than anybody else. And we tend, with a disability especially, if you are not very familiar or comfortable with disability, that we can overthink it and just get really in our own heads and kind of make it more awkward than it needs to be. So a few tips kind of on that level. First, don't draw unnecessary attention to the person's disability or the fact that you are assisting them. What I mean by this are those, bless your heart statements or whatnot. You don't need to make a big spectacle of the fact that you are interacting with or helping someone with a disability. Additionally, this is kind of what we were talking about on the last slide. Don't be overly helpful. So like I said, ask if you can help, extend the offer of help by asking, but accept when someone declines your offer. This will happen from time to time. Trying to do things for the person or insisting on trying to help can come across as patronizing. So if you see someone with a disability who looks like they might be struggling to do whatever it is that they're doing, and you offer to help and they say no, sometimes there can be a tendency to take it personally and think that's about us or the person with a disability is unfriendly or whatnot. Just keep in mind that there are lots of reasons someone with a disability might decline your offer of help, and they are all valid and okay. Okay, so this next one is a big one. And sometimes we do it without even realizing we're doing it. But don't use a special voice as if you were speaking to a child. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this word special in an upcoming slide. But this idea of using that special voice, in my experience, this tends to happen most frequently with adults who have cognitive disabilities or any kind of intellectual disability. For various reasons, our society has kind of positioned people with intellectual disabilities as being children in many ways. And so sometimes, that's where that tendency to speak to someone like a child can come from, but do your best to be mindful of that. And if you are speaking to an adult, regardless of their disability, speak to them the same way you would speak to any other adult. Moving on. Don't repeat yourself in a louder voice if the person doesn't understand. Speak up if appropriate, but try rephrasing your statement or question or use more simple language. I happen to be a somewhat soft-spoken person myself, so certainly speak up, but don't continue to increase the volume thinking that is going to be the difference maker. I'll say this one specifically, I observe sometimes with deaf individuals, and it always is a bit bizarre to me that we think if we shout at the person, that will supersede their deafness somehow. But this last point here of rephrasing your statement or question or using more simple language. And so there has been a move within disability rights spaces to be more intentional about using plain language. I think this can be true, especially for those of us who work in disability services, especially if we have a strong academic background in disability studies or disability issues. We use a lot of jargon. And that sometimes can be very confusing to someone, regardless of disability. So think about the jargon you use, try to rephrase whatever it is you're trying to communicate, and that might in fact be the difference maker. And then this last one, this is a perfect example of how we can make things awkward when we're interacting with people with disabilities. Don't overthink words like walk, run, see, etc. Just speak normally as you would to any other customer. I have lots of friends myself who either use wheelchairs or have vision disabilities or whatnot. And I might say to a friend in a wheelchair, like, hey, you want to run across the street and grab a cup of coffee? Or to a blind friend, like, hey, did you see this new movie? This is not true for everybody, but in my experience, people don't get real hung up on that type of word choice. So you don't need to backpedal if you accidentally use the word walk when speaking to someone with a mobility disability. If you say something that they don't appreciate, they will make that clear to you and let you know, but you can feel comfortable to speak freely the same way you would with anybody else.
All righty.
Go ahead.
I think, thanks, Marty. All right, so now we're going to move on to how to interact with someone using a wheelchair. And I will start off by saying there's typically two types of wheelchairs. There's a manual chair and a power chair. There's no electric chair. So, manual wheelchair, power wheelchair, and usually that's how the disability community distinguishes between one or the other. But it is important to respect the wheelchair as part of someone's physical space. Okay, so I give the example of, many people wear glasses. You wouldn't go up and touch the glasses or take them off someone's face. So this is a part of someone's physical space, the person who uses the wheelchair. So it is important to respect kind of that physical space boundary there. Don't lean on the wheelchair or touch it or move it. Okay, it is their device. It is not yours, unless they have asked you to push them or unless they have asked you to assist in some way, but let them be the one to ask. And you wouldn't put any of your purses or shopping bags on the back of someone's wheelchair. They might do it. It is common for many people who are wheelchair users to have some kind of a backpack or purse or some personal item bag attached maybe to their wheelchair, but that is for them. That's not for you. So it sounds common sense, but you'd be surprised. So just to summarize, don't lean on the wheelchair, touch it or move it. Be mindful to get on eye level. As I like to say, if your interaction with someone is in passing, courteous, 1 to 2 minutes, you wouldn't need to get on their eye level. But if you're going to have a detailed or in-depth conversation with someone, it is more polite to get on eye level. So you could pull up a chair, you could take a knee, you could move to a spot where the both of you are, where you are also in a seated position. So just be on eye level with them, just the courteous thing to do. Be conscious of architectural barriers. This often comes up because in the work that we do, the physical space, making sure that is accessible is a big piece of the overall ADA law. However, oftentimes parking is a little far away. Think festivals, carnivals, special events. So just be mindful if you are traveling or going somewhere with someone who is a wheelchair user, to see if, what the best path is for them to take, and be mindful of architectural barriers that might make it not as smooth a trip for them as it might be for you. So doesn't have to be overthought, doesn't have to have a lot of planning involved, but just be mindful if you're going with a buddy who or a family member who happens to use a wheelchair. Just think ahead a little bit about the architectural barriers that could prevent them from enjoying it the same way you enjoy it. So people, I did want to say, people who use wheelchairs or other assistive equipment may not need to use them all of the time. And this doesn't mean that they are faking. Remember, we said you've seen one disabled person, you've seen one disabled person, and what works for them doesn't always work for the other person. This is true if you, when Marty was going over the list of hidden and invisible disabilities, there are many disabilities where usually someone doesn't need to use a wheelchair, but sometimes during a flare-up or if they're going to be gone for an extended period of time, a wheelchair or a mobility device is helpful to them. So all we are reminding you here today is that please don't judge. Recognize that if someone is using a chair part of the time or only in certain instances, that's their choice, and they should be left alone as to how to make that decision. But it does not mean they're faking. You should not be in judgment of that. In a nice way, I'm telling you to mind your own business, stay in your lane, as they always say, the young kids say these days. But really it means let them do what works for them and helps them be able to enjoy their life and manage their disability in the way they need to. I'll mention the kind of an anecdotal thing. It always comes up. What if you see someone drive into Walmart, park their car, get out, walk into Walmart, and then check out a motorized shopping buggy or shopping cart? The same kind of school of thought applies. That's what they need to do to complete that particular life skill task of going to the grocery store. So it is not up for you to judge. Again, people use wheelchairs at a variety of different times, just like sometimes they use canes and other times they don't. So good things to remember. If you are encountering a little person, just ask what they prefer. Do you want me to take a seat so we can have this conversation, or are you okay to stand and listen to what we're going to talk about or be a part of this group? I have experience with that. There was a family of little people who came to the school back in Florida where my children were going, and everybody was told, kind of in some disability etiquette sessions, don't make a big deal about the height difference, just go on about your business. But it wasn't until one of the parents was in an environment with other parents, and with everybody trying not to make it awkward, she ended up having to stare up at everyone she was in a conversation with and listening to presentations, etc., for a long period of time. So finally, she spoke up and said, it would be really helpful if you all could sit down and we can continue this training. You know, I've been staring up at you for almost an hour now. So again, going back to what Marty said, just ask when in doubt. Don't assume you know what they want, and don't pass judgment on what works for one particular disabled individual. Next slide.
Before we move on, Samantha,
Oh,
I just want to add one thing to make sure that we're being very explicitly clear with, what we're telling you today. So when we say, don't touch a person's wheelchair or lean on it or whatnot, what we're not saying is to pretend like you don't see the wheelchair or
right.
to act as if the wheelchair doesn't exist. As we know, I believe with other marginalized groups of people, acting as if we don't see the differences amongst each other doesn't help anything, and certainly doesn't help when it comes to issues of discrimination, because we do see disability. Some, as we've discussed, we don't see, but lots of it we do. And so if someone who uses a wheelchair maybe has one in a really flashy, bright color, or they've chosen to, kind of decorate it a little bit somehow, or, put some stickers on it, it is absolutely okay to comment and say, hey, cool wheelchair, I really like that color, whatever the case may be. So just wanted to make that abundantly clear. We're giving you lots of do's and don'ts. It is absolutely okay to acknowledge someone's wheelchair or even comment on it. And this is true of all mobility equipment. So
Thanks, Marty. All right, so now we're moving into the next, how do you interact with someone who is deaf or hard of hearing? As Marty touched on when she introduced the disability awareness piece in the beginning, it is important when you are interacting with someone who is deaf or hard of hearing to stand in front of the person. Remember, shouting or yelling to try to get your point across is not going to do anything if someone is deaf. And oftentimes with hard of hearing individuals who wear hearing aids, it's going to create some feedback that is not helpful as well. So be sure to stand in front of the person, be sure that you have their attention. I'm sure if you don't even have much experience working with the deaf and hard of hearing population, it is acceptable to give a tap, give a nudge, wave your hand to get their attention, as well as sometimes tap on the table so like if you're sitting in a group and they can feel the vibration there. But always important to make sure that you have their attention. Talk normally, but be direct. Plain language, as Marty mentioned, is best when trying to communicate directions and information. Be mindful and repeat or rephrase if necessary or if asked. We do this training across the state for nonprofits, for-profit schools, etc. And a little anecdote here, there was a woman who said it's always helpful when people repeat or rephrase that they go back to the beginning of the statement or the sentence, because we tend to usually repeat just the last word. Oh, could you repeat that? Oh, I said box, that's what I said. Well, they are oftentimes missing the entire sentence. So another good kind of thing to remember when asked to repeat or rephrase if necessary. And lastly, be mindful of the level of communication, all right? And this means if you are, you might have seen, we all have smartphones these days, makes it much easier to communicate with someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, to exchange a quick, what type of coffee do you want? I want this type of coffee, or even ordering at Starbucks and other fast food type restaurant environments. So that is a simple way to communicate with someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. If you are having trouble, or if you don't speak, let's say they speak ASL and you don't, ASL being American Sign Language, And so that is fine in quick interactions, but always, always hire an ASL interpreter when appropriate. And so an example of appropriate would be for any high level or complex interactions. And since many of you are aging service providers, what we always say, it is important to know at your place of work or your business how to engage and what your policy is for how to reach an ASL interpreter if you need one. Okay, so if it rises to the level of a complex, whether it's legal, medical information being exchanged. But yes, using our smartphones and quick interaction is often, and I say often, acceptable, excuse me. And then, sometimes even a piece of paper might be helpful if you don't have a smartphone with you. But as going back to that, if you've seen one deaf person using ASL, you shouldn't always assume that everyone is proficient in ASL and that's what every deaf person or hard of hearing person uses, and that there are many ways to communicate. That itself is an entire other training that we can do, but if you are interested in having an effective communication done for your staff or another organization, please reach out to us after we're done here today. I don't think there's anything I forgot on this slide. Marty, any comment before we move on?
I do actually have comment because a few weeks ago I read Deaf Utopia by Niall DeMarco. And so I've been sitting on this quote and I haven't worked it into this presentation yet, but I thought I'd just go ahead and read it to you. And so in his book, he said, whenever you are in conversation with a deaf person via an interpreter, it's best to look directly at the deaf person. They are the one you are having a conversation with, not the interpreter. Looking away from the deaf person takes away the human connection two people have when conversing. And it's very common if you are not comfortable or have much experience interacting with someone who is deaf with an ASL interpreter present as part of that communication, to kind of revert to looking at the interpreter, or even doing things like tell them blah, 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 or ask them blah, blah, blah. You don't need to do that. They're very clear on the purpose that they are serving in that conversation. And it can be very dehumanizing for the deaf individual if you're having a conversation with them and not looking them in the eye as part of that conversation. And you might, if you were in a situation like this where you are interacting with a deaf person and there is an interpreter there, if the interpreter keeps kind of looking over towards the person and breaking eye contact with you, or kind of gesturing to the person, what they are doing is trying to, subtly cue you and remind you, like, hey, that's the person you're talking to. So look at them, not me. So that's the only thing I had to add there. Actually, one more thing. I'll say all of this kind of guidance that you see on this slide, perfect example of, if you're not sure, just ask the person with the disability. And so it's perfectly fine when you're first meeting a deaf person or, starting your interaction with them to say, hey, what is the best way for me to communicate with you? Tell me how you prefer to communicate, and then, follow their lead and do what they tell you.
Marty, I'm glad that you read that quote by, from Niall's book. And I love, in the work that we get to do, we work with so many, and our colleagues we have many deaf colleagues, and we consult and we talk with them. And so it is always, evolving. And one thing that comes to mind just watching television recently is that we have come so far, the newscasters and the reporters have come so far in knowing exactly to do just that. Talk to the person they are interviewing, not make the mistake and talk to the interpreter. So I do notice, just the subtleties. We have come a long way, I think, as a society, in knowing better what to do. And of course, this matters. This is why we're here. This is why we do this kind of work. So thanks for sharing that. And I think it is on to you. You're the next couple slides.
I am. Okay, so now we're going to switch to talking about language, which absolutely is a hot topic when we're talking about how to interact with people with disabilities. And so on this slide here, the title is Language Terms to Avoid. And so we're going to go through this list and I'm going to explain why and hopefully give you some context. But you'll notice the image in the center of this slide is a person who is wearing a white t-shirt with simple text that reads, "Disability is not a bad word." So keep that in mind because a lot of these particularly can be euphemisms that we use in order to avoid saying person with a disability or disabled person. So I just want to, reiterate throughout this that disability is not a bad word. It's a fine word to use. So first on the list is this word handicapped. This one is a little tricky because much of our federal law, at least that pertains to people with disabilities, does in fact use this word handicapped. And part of the reason there is it's helpful to think about the time frame when these laws were written and then passed and signed into law. That was a more common part of our vernacular and how we spoke about people with disabilities. However, when it comes to like handicapped parking, let's say, the more preferred terminology these days is accessible. Handicapped obviously has some very negative connotation. And I hope it's becoming clear to you throughout this presentation that we come from a pretty different perspective about disability compared to how our society has traditionally thought of people with disabilities, in the sense that disability is not a tragedy. It is not the end of the world. It's not, devastating and the worst thing that can happen. There are far worse things that can happen to people, than acquiring a disability. It's not to say that it's no big deal and it's easy breezy. And sometimes, particularly when you have acquired a significant disability, there can be grief that goes along with that. And, I don't mean to invalidate or minimize that experience. But for most of us, we understand disability just to be a pretty normal part of the human experience. It's part of what it means to be a human being on this planet. So I hope that context is a little helpful. But so try to avoid using the word handicapped. Most often, accessible is going to be the best replacement word. I mentioned earlier some euphemisms that we tend to use when we're talking about disability. And in my experience, when people use these types of euphemisms, it's generally very well intentioned. It comes from a kind place, but the impact that it can have is to be very othering, be very patronizing or invalidating. So just keep this in mind. So some of the euphemisms that I mean are terms like handy capable, visually challenged, hearing challenged. It's like we're trying to kind of sugarcoat the topic of disability in the way that most disabled people don't appreciate. There are always exceptions. So I'll say, Samantha and I do this presentation pretty regularly, and you might know someone who happens to use one of these terms. That is okay. We're not trying to give you, absolutes. And as we have said again and again, all of this depends, it varies from person to person. So you might in fact know someone who uses some of these terms or uses the word special needs, which we're going to talk about in a second. That's okay. We're not trying to say, that's a terrible thing and people shouldn't be allowed to use the term special needs to speak about themselves. The key, though, is that's how they are choosing to speak about themselves, rather than you deciding that for them. So it's always fine to defer to how a person chooses to speak about themselves and then follow suit. But let's jump into this word special for a minute. This one is especially important because of the type of work that I do at our agency. And so the goal of much of my advocacy work is that I am working towards and fighting for people with disabilities to be treated equally. Equality is the goal. And so if you take a second to stop and think about it, special and equal are two opposite words. And it gets complicated because we, in our society, we put children in special education, or we talk about special needs, and we have things like the Special Olympics. That can make it a little difficult, when I'm working with a young adult, for example, who has been referred to as special throughout their entire life. And they come to me, I explain to them the type of advocacy we do and the goal of our advocacy work. But what I'm not ever doing is advocating for people with disabilities to be treated specially. We just want to be treated like everybody else, and that's the goal of all of our work at Disability Rights and Resources. On the next slide, we have a short video that hopefully will give you some better context and help you understand a lot of what I'm saying around this word special. Moving on, words like wheelchair bound, confined to a wheelchair, similarly victim of, the next one on the list. It's important to think about these just in terms of their connotation. And so that frames disability in a very negative light. And we've talked about, lots of us don't like that. And we don't like to be referred to as, a negative sort of person or less than or whatnot. Wheelchair bound, confined to a wheelchair. I'm going to talk about this for a second because anybody who uses a wheelchair, that is a choice that they wake up in the morning and make for themselves. I'm going to use my wheelchair today because it gives me independence and it allows me to go out into the world and move about the world and whatnot. So when you say someone's bound to a wheelchair, that's pretty dramatic. I'll say I do have one friend in particular who is a wheelchair user, and one year for Halloween, her costume was that she was wheelchair bound. And so she had like some funny chains that made it look as if she was, strapped to her wheelchair. And she was poking fun at this kind of language that we use. Moving on, this next one, I hope is not news to anybody, but the word retarded is not an acceptable word to use anymore because frankly, most of the ways that we were using that before was as a slur. And so I hope that one goes without saying, and you understand the reasons for not using the word retarded anymore. And then finally, this last one might seem a little nitpicky, but just to put it on your radar, because it's something that I observe and experience, there is a move away from using the term mental illness, but instead talking about mental health issues. I will leave that one at that. Okay, so as I said, we have a quick video. I particularly like this video. I think it's very funny. So we'll pause to watch this briefly.
People with Down syndrome have special needs. Special needs? Really? It would be special if people with Down syndrome needed to eat dinosaur eggs. That would be special.
One dinosaur egg. Enjoy.
Man, I think you were totally right about Wednesday.
If we need to wear a giant suit of armor, that would be special.
I got a condo in Manhattan. Baby girl, what's happening? So gonna get to clapping. Go pop a phone.
It would be special if we needed to be massaged by a cat. If we needed to be woken up by a celebrity.
Wakey, wakey, eggs and bakey. Who are you? You may know me from Scrubs or Office Space. A few darker flicks, The Rock, Platoon, Wall Street. Funny story, I played Ben.
Get out.
My bad.
That would be special. But what we really need is education, jobs, and opportunities, friends, and some love. Just like everybody else. Are these needs special?
Thank you, Carol. I see, and Cynthia, yes, this is one of our favorite videos too. And this is the perfect segue into language does matter. And we carry with us ableist vocabulary, and we tend to use it, and it just becomes part of the things we say over time. But part of the work that we do in diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings is, you know, when people say language matters, the same is true when you're talking about someone who has a disability. And so some of the best practices these days, this is kind of like the hot list of say this, not that. But these are some phrases that you can start using yourself to change the way you refer to things, and hopefully it will continue along with education, awareness, trainings like the one we're doing today, continue to spread throughout different channels and groups and social groups and opportunities as well. So instead of using these words, try using these words. So instead of saying something's idiotic, moronic, dumb, maybe try using illogical, ridiculous, it's irrational, or he is being irrational today. Instead of saying something like crazy, psycho, insane, maybe try using words such as, oh my gosh, that was wild, unbelievable, it's bananas. Instead of spastic, which did come to be in the forefront of the media a few months ago, where Lizzo had a lyric in the performer Lizzo had a lyric in one of her songs, and she ended up taking that lyric out, and I believe it was spaz. She ended up taking that lyric out, that word out, and changing it as not to be offensive. So instead of spastic, use the word clumsy, klutzy. OCD, that gets tossed around quite a bit these days. You know, oh, it's just my OCD, I have to have this perfect and whatnot. Well, that is a mental health disability, and that refers to you know, a clinical condition. So maybe using the term fastidious, you know, she's fastidious about her work, meticulous about her cleaning, focused. You start to see how there are some better choices of words to use. Lame. Instead of saying something is lame, you could say, oh my goodness, this is pointless, boring, uncool. Bipolar, use the word indecisive, unpredictable. And for the term manic, high energy, passionate, amped. So very important, and this list is by no means exhaustive, as many of our lists are, but really the more you start to think about the term you're using, it can go a long way in the way we start to work on getting rid of those ableist terms that have been around for a very long time. It may seem a little overwhelming to try to weed out all of the language from our vocabulary, but it is an ongoing process. And so just take it one step at a time. Start out with 1 or 2 words you'd like to stop using, and then commit to being more conscious and finding more precise words instead. Words that say what you really mean. And I'll stop there in case there are any questions or anybody wants to add any comments at this time. Okay, Gregory Seltzer says, I figured this would come up. How do you helpfully discuss ableist comments when a close friend uses them consistently? All right, it's the word police, as Marty and I always talk about. Marty, do you want to give your kind of commentary on this?
Yeah, so I wish I had like an easy or simple suggestion, but I'm a big believer that it's worth taking the time to have awkward and uncomfortable conversations with each other sometimes. And so I think you said in the comment that it's your friend. So you know, depending on that level of friendship, hopefully, you know, they would be receptive to being like, hey, you know, I know you don't really mean anything by this, but I just wanted to let you know when you say X, it feels bad, or, whatever the case may be. So, that's always a good option. But I do want to kind of reiterate what Samantha's saying of, we're not the language police. That's not what we're trying to do in this presentation today. And some of these terms on this slide, I am comfortable to admit to you, I still use them from time to time, unintentionally without thinking about it. But I find myself more and more lately with some of these words like, lame or dumb or crazy, whatever, to hear it when I say it and think like, oh, that's not what I meant to say. And, it's a process. It takes time. We don't get to just flip a switch and, use different language all of a sudden. So my advice is to extend grace to yourself if it also feels like a struggle for you. Don't beat yourself up about it. Just try to do better. And I always, when we do this presentation, take a minute to just kind of give my little personal pitch about why I think language matters so much and why it's important to think about these things that we're talking about today. Personally, I am a big believer that language is one of the easiest ways that we can be good to each other. And it doesn't cost us a single thing to change our language and to have our language evolve. So just kind of keep that in mind. It can be overwhelming sometimes when we think about, how can I as one person help the world to be a better world today? Language is a really easily available option for all of us. So just keep in mind, we're not trying to, finger wag you about words, but they do matter. So please keep that in mind. I'll also say, Samantha explained to you at the very beginning, what we do and who we work with. And when it comes to people with disabilities, our consumers run the gamut. And so I work with consumers who use a lot of this kind of language. Handicapped, as an example, older consumers sometimes are more likely to use that language, and that's fine. I never correct somebody unless, I'll say, it's usually pretty apparent what the intent is and the way somebody uses these words. And 9 times out of 10, there is no, malicious or unkind intent. And so, in those instances, I never correct someone and say, oh, you shouldn't say handicapped, you should say accessible. We're talking about parking. I do try to model, what I think is the best, most kind language in the way I speak in response to them. But the only time for me, I would ever even consider, language policing someone is if it's very much clear that they are choosing to be unkind by using that language. So I'll just kind of add that. We do have, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what comes to mind, and this came up in a training I did the other day. They said, well, is our family gatherings the time you set the stage, you set people straight with the terms they've been using? And as Marty mentioned, over time, sometimes it's the older consumers, it's our older relatives. And I'm not saying we are not saying go into every family gathering ready to catch, great Aunt Sally with, if she says something wrong. But if the opportunity presents itself, or if asked, please do take a moment and explain, if helpful, why you wouldn't use that term. And of course, the modeling goes far with our friend groups. I have young children. That is how I'm able to share with them if I'm using the language, the preferred language, in describing something I do for a living and the work that I do, or something when we're out in public. But modeling is often powerful. And so I'll stop there. Marty, take it away with the next few slides. But it takes time, and give yourself grace, as Marty says. Usually intent is where you can say, hey, I've heard you repeat this many times, and that is an offensive word to me. Please stop, or else we might not be able to continue doing X together. Yeah.
Thank you, Samantha. So this is our very last slide about language, in case you're getting tired of us telling you what to say and not to say. But this is a big one that there's a lot of confusion about. So just in an effort to try to clear it up, What is this divide between person first and identity first language? And what do people even mean when they use those terms? I can tell you, I have an academic background in disability studies, and this was really driven home very hard in all of our classes. And we would spend a lot of time practicing using person first language. But I can tell you, now that I have been working in disability rights spaces for many years, that push for person first language does not seem to be coming from the disability community ourselves. Again, as we keep saying, it's different from person to person. But just my personal experience has been that this move or this need for person first language, many people with disabilities feel differently. And you will have noticed also that Samantha and I switch back and forth between both of these. So we're not going to tell you use one or the other, but it's important to be aware of. So what do we mean with person first and identity first? So person first language, these images on your screen here, I have a link at the bottom for you if you'd like to read the article that they went along with. But an example would be to say a person with autism. So the person is first. It's helpful sometimes when you plug in someone's name. So it could be, Joe with autism, as opposed to identity first, in which case saying autistic person or autistic Joe or whatever the example might be, that's also okay. And so there are different, kind of ways of thinking about these things. And like I said, it's going to be different from person to person. My best advice to you, though, is to pay attention to how a person chooses to speak about themselves and follow their lead. I know we're repeating ourselves, but we can't drive home this point enough. Just follow the person's lead, do what they do. And so whatever language they choose to speak about themselves, it is okay for you to follow suit and also use that language. We don't want to belabor the point here with this. And I'll say, if you're faced with a moment of, I need to choose between the two and I don't know which is right, it's probably a little safer to err on the side of person first. That's going to be the least likely to offend. So that's fine. But pay attention to, the person you're speaking with and the language that they choose. And, as we've said, follow their lead. Okay, so we are coming to the tail end of this presentation. So we're going to take just a minute briefly to talk about service animals, kind of similar to this kind of disability etiquette or best practice when it comes to interacting with people with disabilities. And we do whole presentations just on service animals. So there's a lot that we could say here, and I'm going to try to keep it brief. But under the ADA, just so you are aware, a service animal is a dog or miniature horse that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. The task or tasks performed must be directly related to the person's disability. But let's get to the good stuff. So you run into someone with a service animal. What do? You should know that it really is not appropriate to pet or distract a service animal, even if you ask politely. So it can be helpful sometimes to think of it like a piece of equipment. And if you would not ooh and ah and gush over someone's wheelchair, you don't need to do that about their service animal. And so just to hopefully make this make a little more sense, like all of this, it's going to depend on the person. And certainly, I know some very outgoing individuals who have service animals who don't mind attention. The key thing to keep in mind, though, is that they make that very clear very quickly within an interaction. And so if a person's like, oh, you can pet him, he's friendly or whatnot, then by all means, that's fine. But to give you an example, so we recently had an intern at our agency who uses a service animal, and she and I were talking one morning about our weekends, I think, and what we were up to. And she told me about, going into a CVS or some kind of drugstore with her service dog. And she was there to pick up her prescription or something, wasn't feeling especially great that day. And she said, no less than 4 people stopped me to talk to me about Crush, my service dog. And I was just trying to like get in and out. It's such a nightmare having these interactions all the time. And it really, just made a lot of sense in my mind hearing her speak about it like that. I'm a fairly introverted person, and I can tell you the idea of walking into a Target, let's say, having to, stop and talk to strangers the entire time I'm in that Target, that's my nightmare, honestly. So, just keep that in mind. If it's certainly better to ask if you can pet a service animal rather than just going ahead and doing it, but it's even better to not ask and not make a big fuss about it. Certainly, if it's someone or you've been talking to for a while, that's a bit different if that it comes up as a point of conversation. But to just approach a stranger to talk to them about their service animal or ask them questions, that is unwanted for many people. So I will keep it at that. If you have questions, absolutely feel free to put them in the chat. But I will turn it back over to Samantha for our last slide.
Thank you, Marty. All right, so you have sat through our presentation today, and you are at the part where you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, I want a copy of this presentation, and how can I learn more? So we have compiled kind of our best suggestions as to where to seek more information. The things listed here are given to our new employees and our new volunteers, board members as part of the onboarding process here at our agency. So we recommend you plug into us, your local Center for Independent Living. We have a monthly newsletter that comes out every other month, and we also have a monthly advocacy council meeting. So that is free. It is open to everyone. It happens on the second Thursday of every month at 10 a.m. and we provide trainings on a variety of different ADA and disability related topics, as well as entertain local disability experts. So please connect with us. We are happy to answer questions, but get you involved in the work that we're doing. We recommend the book Being Human by our recently deceased, rest in peace, Judy Heumann, kind of the mother of disability rights in the independent living movement. She has a wonderful kind of late life memoir, excuse me, that she published just the other year. So Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist by Judy Heumann. You can Google even Judy Heumann if you are not familiar with her. Crip Camp, of course, a very popular documentary that came out a few years ago, produced by Michelle and Barack Obama. You can find it on Netflix. Judy was one of several disability rights and independent living pioneers featured in it. So Crip Camp, definitely check it out if you haven't already. Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally by Emily Ladau. She is at the bottom image on our screen, and then Judy and Alice Wong are up at the top. Which leads me to the next resource, Disability Visibility, First Person Stories from the 21st Century by Alice Wong. And then lastly, an oldie but goodie, No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movement by Joseph Shapiro. So this is kind of our heavy hitter list, but as Marty and I say often, seek out disabled content creators. There is more information than you would ever think or want to know out there on social media, on the web. Seek out, disabled content creators, just to kind of get inside their mind a little bit about what their life is like and hear from them. We are happy to recommend other accounts and other books and websites. So you just have to reach out to us to find those. But this is our best list. and really do it justice, as we say. You know, disability is not a dirty word. So really, the more you can read and learn and know, change your language is going to be the most helpful. Volunteer. We are always entertaining and seeking volunteers. And just remember, representation matters and words matter, and be kind. And we're all on this learning journey. Next slide. And then we'll go to questions. All right, I know here is our contact information. You're welcome to reach out to us by phone or by email. Marty and I, we're happy to speak with you. And we mentioned some other training opportunities. So let us know. Thank you all for the comments. Let me see if there are some that we didn't address. All right. Thank you, Marty. Let's go back up to the comments. This one is a service animal question, Marty. So since you handled that slide, I've actually been told never to pet a service animal. I've heard that this can undermine the help that the animal can provide. Yes, Marty.
Yeah, I would say as a rule of thumb, that is exactly right. It's important to keep in mind, and I probably did not do a great job of making this very clear when we were on that slide. But the range of tasks that service animals are performing is varied, and they do a lot of different things. And for some service animals specifically, in the nature of the task that they're performing for their handler, it's really important to not distract that animal. And so that's just kind of what I observe happen the most often, and why it's a problem, is we can actually kind of get in the way and mess up the job that animal is there to perform. So like I said, different from person to person. And I happen to know people with service animals who, you can kind of think of the service animal as an extension of that person and their personality. And so for more outgoing, friendly, big personality types, sometimes they like that attention. But for sure, wait to see, if the person themselves is encouraging interaction with their service animal. And if that's okay for them and doesn't cause a problem, they're going to make that very clear to you. So if that hasn't been made explicitly clear to you, then yes, I would say try to avoid, petting the animal or even making faces at the animal. I'm a dog lover, to be clear, so I get it. But it's just important to kind of be intentional and be mindful of these things when we are around or in the presence of a service animal.
Thank you, Marty. I did want to scroll back up to Derek's comment. He said it is a person first versus identity first language. It is a metric for us at the area agency on aging when speaking with older adults. It gets to a pretty granular place. For example, a person dealing with dementia versus a person with dementia. So thank you for that comment, or a person has dementia. So thank you for that comment. Let me see if there's anything else.
I'll add on that one real quick. In my experience, this does seem to be something that is a bit different along generational lines. And so I do know many young disability rights activists and advocates who really not just prefer identity first language, but it really ruffles their feathers or even can offend them a little bit if you use person first language instead of identity first. Like we said, there's not one right answer. You will have noticed Samantha and I both kind of move in between both of those in terms of how we speak to and about our consumers, as well as how we speak about ourselves. So just know that it's all valid and it's all legitimate is the main takeaway, if nothing else. However, someone with a disability or a disabled person chooses to speak about themselves is valid.
Thanks, Marty. And I think we have time for one more comment. Thank you, Laura. It says, how are referrals made to your office for prospective consumers? Laura, it's very easy. They would just either send us an email or call. I would say first call the number, because we have trained staff to take those, do intake and assess the call, and then route it to the appropriate department. So it's a free call. Our services are free. We don't verify disability. So it's kind of a win-win-win. Any other questions?
I'll just add real quick also, when it comes to making referrals, spread our information far and wide, including our names individually. And if you ever want to shoot us an email or whatnot, just to let us know, hey, I talked to this person the other day and, I think they're going to be giving you a call. That's fine. But no, there's no obligation to do that. So you have our blessing to give our information to anybody who could use it. So.
And Laura, follow up, how long is the intake process? We don't do your typical case management intake process. So it would vary per person depending on the services. We also don't do direct services out of our office, many direct services out of our office. So it could be anywhere from a 10-15 minute conversation to a longer, more detailed conversation. But just as we mentioned in the beginning, it depends. And so the level of, engagement will depend based on the disability, based on the situation, whether it's advocacy or just information and referral, etc. And Marty just put our contact information in the chat, so you know how to get in touch with us. But thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful group. We appreciate the interaction, and thank you to Centralina for asking us to be the speakers today. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, guys, thank you so much for being here. And I did just see one more question that got asked twice, if you're okay answering one more. And it was about, at the start of the webinar, you shared a visual description of your appearance. When is it appropriate to offer these? And would it be appropriate to ask an individual if they would appreciate these?
I'm going to say you are never wrong if you provide a visual description of yourself in person or on a Zoom. It's kind of commonplace in the circles where we work and move, and the spaces and cross disability work that we do. Marty, any comments on that?
Yes, I can just tell you at our agency, at least when Samantha and I do presentations, we have switched to just kind of doing it as best practice, the same way that we share our pronouns. I'll say that anytime you're having any kind of virtual meeting or presentation, it's a really good idea to do, even if there's nobody who is blind or low vision in your participants or your audience. Because there's so many different ways to connect virtually, it's very common that someone might be, in the car on the way to pick up their kids and they're listening, and so they don't see the screen. And so it's beneficial for those people. And I hope maybe you might have noticed as we were going through this presentation, anytime there was a slide with an image on the screen, Samantha and I did our best to describe that to you for the same reasons that people do image descriptions. So I hope that helps.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you for being here today. I know everybody has asked if they can have a copy of the slides. The answer is yes, we will share that. We recorded the presentation, so we'll post that on our website and send it out as well. So thank you again, Marty and Samantha. That was great. Great presentation. Lots of positive feedback I'm seeing.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye.